I would like to welcome all of you to the fall presidential lecture series. I was looking at the number, and it's been quite a bit. For those of you who are new to the experience, let me indicate to you that the presidential lecture series was something that emanated from a very dedicated committee of faculty at the college, and we were trying, this started in the year 2000, we were trying to find a way in which we could not only showcase the fact that we are part of the CUNY family, but also that we could showcase the faculty from CUNY and the faculty from our college. So the theory is that we have a luminary from CUNY, not from our college, in the fall lecture series, and a luminary from Queensboro in the spring lecture series. We have had a number of them. We started in the spring of 2001 with Tony Pippolo, and was one of ours and since retired. And we've had a number of individuals from, as you have in your program, from Billy Collins, the poet laureate for the United States, to our own Louis Mirror as Executive Vice Chancellor, and now the Executive Vice Chancellor Selma Botman. First of all, I'd like to really express my appreciation to Selma Botman for spending some time with us today. This is an incredibly busy lady. If you think that it's hard to get an appointment with me, try to get an appointment with her. Probably the next available time is April of 2008. But in her responsibility as Executive Vice Chancellor and for academic affairs for the university, she's basically responsible for all of the curriculum in the City University of New York. And as you very well know, the university is very much interested in raising standards, in tiering the university, and in providing a wonderful network of community colleges that can serve as portals of entry into this very fine university. And it's through her work that we have had some major successes, from the Teachers Academy to a very important program that exists right now, the Black Male Initiative, that is being very successful within the university. She's a strong supporter of existing programs such as College Now, has been a tremendous success, and I'm using CUNY jargon, so let me explain that to the members of the community at large. The College Now is a dual enrollment program with the local high schools that has been very successful for the university. So Selma Botman clearly is a member of the team that has transformed the university. We like to call it a renaissance. But she's also a scholar. And she's I didn't ask her what year she graduated from Harvard, but I was going to embarrass Dr. Tai, who's also graduated from the Harvard, got her PhD in '96 in history, and so similar
many years before that.
so we have a historian here, and if you ever want a job as a part-time faculty member at Queensboro in the history department, Dr. Rizzoni, are you here? I won't speak for him, but I am certain that he would consider your resume.
Thank you.
As is stated in your program, Dr. Botman is going to be talking about citizenship. She's going to be talking about the contrast between the concept of citizenship in the Middle East and in the United States. I look forward to the lecture. I know, I have heard her speak. She's a wonderful speaker, and she's truly a scholar of merit. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs of the University, Dr. Selma Botman.
Thank you, President Marti. I am delighted to be here at Queensboro Community College, and I am truly honored that President Marti invited me to participate in his presidential lecture series. And thank all of you for coming out this afternoon to join us. I want to talk today about opening doors. doors to educational opportunity, doors to community action, and doors to authority. In a very real sense, the work that goes on every day of the week here at Queensborough Community College, and indeed across the City University system, is guided by the passionate belief that doors should be open to people of all backgrounds, of all races, of both genders, and we passionately believe in the purpose and the utility of education. In many countries of the world, education is viewed as a portal to effective citizenship and as a platform for strengthening democratic society. Where democracy is absent and where education is underfunded, then education is not perceived as a basis for the functioning of civil society. Significantly, we also find in such societies narrow definitions of citizenship. In these societies where citizenship is contracted, we find that doors are often closed in the educational sphere, in the political and economic sphere, to women, to the poor, and to people who are in minority communities. Their citizenship is limited, and as a result, their contributions to society are also constrained. Today, I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on how doors can be opened and citizenship can be constructed. First, I'd like to offer some ideas gleaned from studies of 20th century history in Egypt, a century that produced grassroots movements of a political and social nature worthy of comment. And then I will bring the discussion home, so to speak, addressing the role of education, especially higher education, in the United States and even at City University of New York. What I hope to demonstrate in the end is the power of opening doors through expansive legal rights as well as through education in shaping an empowered citizenry as well as a more peaceful and prosperous society. Through both my academic and administrative work, I've thought a lot about democratic movements, democratic societies, both in the United States and in Egypt, where my research has focused for the last 25 years. I've been especially interested in how societies become fairer, more equal, and more satisfying for all those who live within them. I've come to believe unalterably that education facilitates not only human growth, but societal growth as well. Education enhances the progress of democracy by offering all people, regardless of gender, race, socioeconomic background, the chance to transform their own lives and to contribute to the societies in which they live. By education, I mean that process by which we learn to understand and to respect, to teach tolerance of different people, of different ideas, of broad-mindedness toward controversial ideas, and the recognition that civility and equality are fundamental concepts of any successful society. Openness in education must go hand in hand with civil and political rights of all people. Otherwise, its effects are ephemeral. In my most recent book, Engendering Citizenship in Egypt, I examined the meaning and practice of citizenship for women in 3 distinct political periods in 20th century Egypt. I looked at women's struggle for inclusivity, the right to take their place in their society, This struggle for civil and political rights has been erratic, successful at some moments, and frustrating and seemingly hopeless at others. But throughout the 20th century in Egypt, women worked to transform the political, social, legal, economic, and educational conditions in the country. Their work continues today, and their story is worth telling, however briefly. What did it mean to be a citizen in 20th century Egypt? What forms of activity were considered worthy of citizenship? Who got to be a full citizen, and on what basis? What was women's role in the political, social, and economic life? These are some of the questions that guided my research. While my operative assumption was that societies are strengthened when all people, when all talent, when all energy and brains belonging to both men and women, young and old, members of all races, religions, and upbringings are marshaled in the service of the nation, I tried to look at the country without any predetermined mindsets. I studied and tried to understand the traditions, the rituals, the practices and beliefs that provided people with opportunity and encouraged them to take action. What I learned was that the political structure in 20th century Egypt was applied selectively to critical groups, depending on who was in power and how a given regime saw its political goals and objectives. During the first period I studied, the years between the 1920s and the 1950s, a semi-liberal democratic experiment was launched in Egypt. And with it came the hallmarks of an emergent democracy, a constitution, contested elections, diverse political parties, and parliamentary sessions. But liberal democracy was undermined by an excessively powerful monarch, British colonial domination, and a culture that did not prize equality. From a gendered perspective, the basic principles of liberty and individual rights were compromised when Egyptian constitutionalism denied women the vote and any public role in society. Despite the fact that women fought for national independence against British rule, they were denied any official public role outside nationalist demonstrations and strikes. In peacetime, women were kept at home, where their self-image and society's image of them depended exclusively on their performance as mothers and wives. Educational opportunity at this time was very limited to a tiny slice of the Egyptian elite, and women did not fit into this characterization. Because women had no legal role in public society, they could not transcend their gender status and carry out the obligations of citizenship. Gender, therefore, had a profound impact on public and private life in Egypt in the first half of the 20th century. In essence, women were excluded from citizenship rights and denied the vote, and also denied a voice in their own lives, in their children's lives, and in the lives of their menfolk as well. During the second period I studied, the years of military rule from 1952 to 1970, leaders invalidated the semi-liberal democratic experiment that had existed and created in its place a state-run society which was devoid of even the most limited tolerance of independent activity. But and this is very important, citizenship in this period evolved to include women. Women were granted the right to vote, they were encouraged to work, and further, equality was important in the minds of the rulers. They were given opportunities to enter primary education, secondary education, and even higher education, which previously had only been available to an exclusive small sector of affluent men and boys. This was a period when democratization when education was in fact democratized and opened to all people of all social classes. In this era, with its emphasis on modernization and economic development, the military deemed women's brains and brawn necessary to the building of the new society. So slowly and in small numbers, women entered politics, trade unions, and cultural life. And they became participants in a society in a public way. Their citizenship expanded during this time, even though women remained underrepresented in the highest levels of political life. To some observers, the period between 1952 and 1970 represented a golden era for women's rights in Egypt. Women became a truly significant presence at Cairo University, the main national university in the country. They worked outside the home, they stood for political office, they cast votes. At the same time, however, women remained the primary caretakers of their children, and family life remained traditional. So while public life changed for women in this period, private life remained exactly the same as it had been in the era before. Women lacked independent status once they were married and continued to be subordinated to the personal power of their husbands while at home. Because the regime was not prepared to connect reforms in the public domain with changes in the structure of home life, traditional definitions of gender were reformulated but not abandoned. Women's citizenship, therefore, progressed only to the extent that the regime required for the modernization and development of the country. In the third period I looked at, the period from the 1970s onward, I noticed that Egypt moved away from state socialism, away from military rule, and toward a more liberal capitalist philosophy. The government at that time strengthened its bonds with the United States and Western Europe and created new alliances in the Middle East as well. Yet freedom and economic development remained elusive, with too many Egyptians still suffering from limited civil and political rights, from educational deficiencies and economic distress. Women who were the beneficiaries of expanded education and career opportunities under Nasser in the previous period now experience a new conflict with regard to citizenship. In essence, while the state cautiously forwards the idea of the inclusivity of women in political and economic arenas, conservative organizations and movements in the country vigorously promote an alternative view. They venerate women who stay at home to care for the family and want to limit women's activity in the labor force and in the public arena. They, in fact, subscribe to the view that men and women should be separated in the public arena in order to preserve personal integrity. And they espouse an ideological structure that privileges men. In the last 25 years, then, two conflicting trends have emerged. On the one hand, there are those who approve women's participation in politics, in the marketplace, and in education. On the other hand, there are those, including even at institutions of higher education like Cairo University, there are those who represent more culturally conservative views about what is permissible behavior for women. Ultimately, in Egypt today, we see that citizenship rights have been regulated by those who control the political, economic, culture, and religious discourse, the result of which is a restrictive view of rights and responsibilities. The recent social history of Egypt, which I have all too briefly tried to summarize for you, suggests to me that it will take men and women's work to accomplish reform, to unite the public and the private domains, and to harmonize the definition of citizenship. The democratization of all levels of society, the family, the workplace, schools and universities, the community, and the state are the best hope for the emergence of a vibrant civil society. If we shift our view to the United States, we too have witnessed our struggles for equality on our own shores. Women now obviously have the vote, but that right was secured, as in Egypt, only after great effort. It took the United States until 1920 to pass the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to the ballot box. I see women's suffrage as emblematic of a larger struggle prevailing in the annals of American history, the struggle to open doors to citizenship and to true democracy. And that includes opening the doors to higher education, to women, and to men of all races and social and economic backgrounds. It is an inclusive definition of civility, of eligibility, in order to ensure the viability of a democratic civil society. Things in my background have taught me that history can be studied through multiple lenses. My work on Egypt provides me one approach, but here's another. The history of the American nation can be studied through the changing configurations of the American college, and in particular, the changing configuration of who has been allowed to enter and succeed within higher education in the United States. From the outset, American higher education was seen as supporting the building of the nation, but our early leaders had a very particular vision of how this nation should be built. Because America's first colleges were created with religious affiliations, and because young men were groomed for leadership within their denominations, these institutions of higher education schooled men for the clergy. Significantly and typically, women were not part of this early equation. As we all know, in higher education today, this has radically changed, where women outnumber men on most colleges across the country, and certainly at City University of New York. If the addition of women to a campus population is understood as an early example of providing educational access to a more diverse population, the concept of diversity has itself continued to expand over time. The decades following World War II offer an excellent example of exactly this development. At that time, the size and quality of public universities grew in the United States, and the community college system developed to afford educational opportunity to millions of first-generation college students. The government spearheaded these changes to effect a new and more skilled society. At CUNY, we are built on the premise that a quality education must be accessible to members of our community. The students of this great university come from nearly 200 countries. They speak 120 languages. More than 2/5 of our student population was born outside the United States. As a social scientist, I find these and the many other cultural layers inherent in the CUNY community utterly compelling. They need to be reckoned with and respected as we ask the big questions about how best to educate our students in this new century and ensure the survival of our democracy. In Egypt, democracy has withered because true citizenship has been restricted to a chosen few. The society's ability to function and prosper in this competitive global economy is hindered by the dysfunction of its civil society and by the weakness of its educational institutions. We in the United States are privileged to embrace full citizenship rights for all our citizens, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or gender. And we acknowledge the power of higher education, and particularly public higher education, which we insist on being available to all who seek it. I became a professor and later an academic administrator because I believe in the power of colleges and universities as sites where important work takes place. I believe it is where democratic society is deepened, where life's lessons are learned and carried out, and where equality and civility prevail. I feel lucky to be part of this world of higher education, and I know all of those at City University share this view. I only hope that Egypt's institutions aspire to the kind of work that we are so proud of at this university and in this country. And so again, I thank President Marti for inviting me here today, for offering to you some comments and ideas about citizenship in Egypt, about education in the United States, and I am pleased to respond to any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Botman. Wonderful presentation, and I can attest, and I think we can all attest to the fact that CUNY is in good hands. I can see that. I can see that from the reaction of the audience. Thank you very much for being willing to take some questions, and now let me open the floor to anyone. Any questions, any comments?
Women who hold places of leadership. In America, we are finding pockets of people who are askance at a woman actually running for the President of the United States. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiments that you've expressed. I think there is a sense in the United States that we are the most progressive country in the world. If you look at countries in South Asia, you will find women prime ministers. If you look at European countries, you will find female prime ministers. And yet in the United States, women have had a very difficult time actually breaking through the glass ceiling of electoral politics. I think it is, it may change. We have a female candidate who stands the chance of becoming elected to the highest office in this land. But as you rightly suggest, her gender will cause some degree of skepticism amongst some voters, men and women. And it is, I think, a mark of a society still in need of some self-reflection about what makes a leader, what are the characteristics that we want our leaders to have, not what anatomy we want our leaders to have, but what kind of leadership characteristics we want them to have. We may not be there yet.
Citizenship concepts in Egypt, of course, the elephant in the room is Sharia, and the concepts within Islamic law about diverse spheres and the role that women can play. And I'm thinking about some of the material that I go over with my students when I teach the history of women, and we read Huda Sharari's memoirs, and she talks about, this connection that she very clearly perceives between her limited educational opportunities and the constricted role that she plays in the Egyptian nationalist forum. So I'm wondering, when you talk about these concepts of citizenship, are you thinking about it very specifically as being affected in any way by Islamic law? Is there a sense that some kind of authentic citizenship as it's perceived in Egypt has to be male because of the connection to Islamic traditions?
I will begin by saying that there are feminists in the Middle East and across the United States, both Muslim feminists and non-Muslim feminists, who argue that Islam, in fact, and Islamic law, Sharia law, is not inherently misogynist. That, in fact, it is the uses to which law have been put that have restricted women's ability to behave in public society. I do think, in contrast to Western society, I do think one of the characteristics in Muslim society is the sharp separation between the public and the private spheres. And, I thought a lot about this in connection with citizenship because, and this is actually, in my view, also transparent in the United States as well, or any society, that you can make all the reforms you would like in the workplace, in the political world as well, in the marketplace, in education, but if there is no democracy, if there is no equality in the family, then women will be restricted. So without democracy in the family, I do not believe there will be true democracy in the society, in public life. I think it is, some people will argue that religious law is confining. Other people will take issue with that. I would take issue with that myself. And Hoda Sharawi, who is the writer you mentioned, is a very interesting character in Egyptian history. She is the daughter of a very wealthy man whose mother was a concubine. Okay, the father had more than one wife, which is admissible in Islamic law, and she grew up herself in a harem. Harem life has disappeared in Egypt, and no longer, most people in society would not have the resources to run a harem. That is a restricted place for women and a separate place for men. So she writes in the early 20th century about an era that's long gone. And her situation was different as well because she straddled two camps. The very conservative camp of upper-class Egyptian society. Her mother wasn't even Egyptian, she was a Circassian. And this whole new world of oppositional nationalist politics, which she was trying to step into and to affect. So she's a beloved figure in 20th century Egyptian history, but she's not a typical Egyptian woman. But I'm so delighted to hear that you've introduced your students to her. Do you read the Harem Years? Is that what? The other interesting point about Hoda Sharawi, and this has an impact on citizenship, is that she was one of the first women who threw off the veil in public. And she was able to do this and get away with it because she was a member of the elite. You know, the security officers actually, she was coming back from an international conference in Italy, and she was at the train station in Alexandria, and she had a small group of women with her, and they removed the veil. And the security forces immediately sort of pounced on them, and then they realized it was Hoda Sharawi, and you know, they you know, carted this little group off, but nothing, you know, there were no charges brought against them. But that was social class that was you know, important at the time.
In your presentation, you identified as conservative organizations, but you didn't give us specifics.
Right.
Their continuing influence even onto the campus at Cairo University. People like to talk about the brilliance of the American democratic experiment and how fortunate we were at the founders coming upon certain principles that have served us so well. Early on, it was recognized that we needed that First Amendment. And so we have the benefit of a notion about separation of church from state, which plays out in our institutions of public education through academic freedom, intended in part to keep other organizations from influencing what goes on inside the academy. To what degree do you attribute those notions to serving the kind of movement toward equality that we have experienced in this country, particularly, as you notice, most of the students at our university are female. The fact that public education has, in part, you know, led to that this is one of the liberating institutions for our democratic order.
You know, it is almost impossible to talk about academic freedom in a society that itself is not free. And so while students may feel able to converse with one another in this period today, which is different from a generation ago, where students, like other members of society, were always looking over their shoulder for a security agent to whisk them away into jail. Students may feel free to speak with one another, but academic freedom requires an infrastructure of societal freedom. And that really doesn't exist now. So I don't think you will, you know, you would be sanguine about the intellectual climate that exists at the university. As for the organizations, you know, I was deliberately evasive about them. Because I don't want to characterize them in any narrow sense to be misunderstood, frankly. But those conservative organizations that are in ascendancy in the country do, in my view, you know, threaten all of the advances that women have achieved over the course of this century. Did that answer your question?
I understand that people are sometimes prone to a simple-minded equation that if you were to say Islamic, they think that is the core of Islam, that's all Islam. But I think it kind of weakens our efforts to work against those forces, to not identify them sometimes. You can't deny that there is that element therein. But you did answer the question.
Yeah, but I want to be clear here, Phil. You know, I think that there are conservative movements in the country that have no connection with religion. So it is not exclusively a religious movement, although there is a basis of that, to be sure. You know, were this an entirely, progressive political society in Egypt, that still might not guarantee the role of women in the society. It might be progressive in terms of its, its economic ideology or its educational ideology, but still with limitations for certain segments of society.
I'm very intrigued by your statement about family and government. On the Nasser, socialism, stigmatized in the Soviet Union, the equalization of women in government was very similar to what happened in my own country in the past. From one moment to the next, there was a tremendous influence of women into the government and others, army. Yet, in reality, the societal subjugation of the women was based on family. And I wonder if, I have not been in Cuba in 47 years, so I can't attest. And I would love to go if anybody wants to organize a trip. It would be interesting to understand if that, in fact, has taken place, or has a long period of socialist rule in a country like Cuba that was very much like the description we have in Egypt. Had Nasser been in power longer?
Nasser was not a feminist. He was not an anti-feminist. The question he was trying to answer was, how do we elevate this society through economic development? And what do we need as a society to accomplish development which was absent in the previous liberal democratic phase? And he made a calculation that he needed everyone in society. And I presume that's the Castro model as well. It is much more radical and much more transformative to really look at what happens in a family as opposed to simply what goes on in the marketplace or what goes on in a classroom. And I think that in this country, this is still an evolutionary process. And I'm not talking about the elimination of gender or, anything, of this nature. I'm talking about democracy, civility, and respect in all our institutions. And I consider the family one of those institutions that needs to be transformed for people's aspirations to really be rewarded. So, I don't think Nasser thought about the issues in gender terms. He only thought in economic terms. And it was the feminists themselves, women who were taking steps toward their own liberation, who were raising these questions in what at that time, appeared to be very controversial ways. But, I think in Egypt, this remains a real issue. What happens in the family? And I think this is an international issue, actually. It's not Western, it's not Muslim, it's not Middle Eastern, it's an international issue. And, it's a work in progress, I think. Well, I spent a year and a half in Egypt doing research. over the course of a period of time. And I had a wonderful experience because Egyptians are amongst the most gracious, welcoming people I know, and people are guests in their country and treat them and are treated so. You know, when I went to do my research the first time when I was working on my dissertation, I was working on a political movement, not on women. I was working on something completely different. I was working on the communist movement in Egypt, actually, and communism was illegal, remains illegal in Egypt. So how, as a researcher, do you access documents and political court cases and information on a movement that people don't have the First Amendment rights to talk about? So that was a challenge for me. And, you know, I used the archives that were there. I used libraries that were there. And just one anecdote about the archive will give you a sense of how demanding it was to do research at this time. When I went into the archive, there was a very nice man, archivist, who asked me what I wanted to see. And I was interested in looking at the political history of Egypt from about 1920 to about 1960. And I wanted to understand the role of the communist movement at that time. I couldn't tell him I wanted to study communists because he wouldn't have shown me any documents. So he said, sit down and talk to me. So I sat down, and for weeks and weeks I sat down and talked to him and drank tea and drank coffee, and we got to know each other. And he said, you wear a wedding ring. Where's your husband? And I said, my husband's in America, and I'm all by myself here doing research, and I need you to help me. But he over time, got to know me and began to give me documents. And at one point he came, you know, we worked at open tables, and he came to my table and he said, you really are interested in whether Anwar Sadat, who was president at that time when I was in Egypt, you really are interested in whether Anwar Sadat was a collaborator with the Nazis, aren't you? And I said, no, not at all. I mean, not at all. I'm interested in grassroots movements, and I went on and on and on. So he developed in his mind some completely alternative picture of what I was trying to accomplish. But he did, over time, bring me boxes of materials that I looked at, and I spent about 6 months, you know, off and on, going to the archive, sitting with him, drinking tea, trying to get documents. But I also went to libraries and read all the newspapers from the period, and those were open and available. I was able to do interviews with former communists who put me in touch with the lawyers who actually defended the communists in prison, and you know, was enormously lucky that they gave me access to the political court cases, which was a treasure trove of information, because at that time, the authorities wrote into the court record pamphlets and political materials from that period that were lost to history. So I photocopied all the materials I got and gave one copy to people in Egypt and took one copy back home. So my contribution for, you know, all these wonderful people helping me write my first book was that I then got access to information that they didn't have and left it with people in Egypt. So, you know, it was hard work. It was very hard work, but because people helped me, I was able to do it. With regard to the veil, it's a huge controversy. There are some people who say that the veil inhibits women's role in society because it makes them invisible. There is another school of thought that says women are able to navigate public space when they're covered and they are desexualized. So there are these two competing views. I'm not an advocate of the veil myself, but you know, I share with you these two views because you have progressive people on both sides of the argument, and it's not so it's not as simple as we think it is, just looking at covered people.